In this, the first manned flight of the Apollo program, Apollo 7 will lift off Cape Kennedy's Pad 34 atop a Saturn 1B, largest launch vehicle ever used for an American manned spaceflight. Its thrust, over 1,500,000 pounds. First stage separation will occur approximately 2.5 minutes after liftoff, followed almost immediately by second stage ignition. About 17 seconds later, the launch escape tower will be jettisoned. Some 10 minutes after liftoff, the first manned Apollo will enter its Earth orbit. In the command module, checkout of all vital systems will now begin. Spacecraft Commander Wally Schirra will be in the left couch position. To his right, Don Isley. To his right, Walt Cunningham. The Apollo 7 flight plan calls for the accomplishment of more than 45 important tests to be performed by the crew during the course of the mission. 34 of these tests are called principal, which means they are not mandatory for this flight, but must be performed before the first lunar mission. One of these will begin near the end of the second orbit, as the Apollo 7 mission moves to its 4th hour. In daylight over Hawaii, the spacecraft commander will separate the spacecraft from the Saturn's second stage. The spacecraft will move slowly out and ahead. At a distance of about 100 feet, a transposition maneuver will be made, turning the spacecraft around so that it faces the booster, allowing the astronauts to photograph the adapter panels on the last stage of the launch vehicle. The spacecraft commander will again fire the small thrusters and begin to move toward the last stage. If this were a lunar mission, the command module would now be facing a large compartment containing the lunar module. Docking and latching operations would make the two modules a single spacecraft, destined to separate again after going into moon orbit, the lunar module carrying 2 of the crew's 3 astronauts down to the moon's surface. This time, the docking will only be simulated, but the capability for performing this operation will have been proven. The astronauts will sleep in 2 shifts, Don Isley first, then Wally Schirra and Walt Cunningham simultaneously. Each sleep period will last 8 hours, and the first will begin about 7.5 hours after liftoff. Although this is a long-duration flight, the astronauts will not shave. They will eat together and will perform all scheduled major tests during the 8-hour periods that all of them are awake. One of the most interesting of these tests is planned to take place during the second day. The object of this test, rendezvous with the Saturn. The astronauts will now be in lightweight flight coveralls, their pressure suits removed and stowed. The last stage will, by this time, have drifted to a point approximately 80 miles behind the spacecraft. With the firing of the main rocket, the spacecraft will begin the maneuver, dropping into an orbit somewhat below that of the Saturn. In slightly more than an hour, the spacecraft will coast to a position about 60 miles above the Saturn. As it coasts back to a lower altitude, it will find itself in a position roughly 100 miles behind the Saturn. At 9 miles below the Saturn's orbit, the main rocket will be fired again, adjusting the spacecraft so that it maintains this 9-mile altitude difference. About an hour and 20 minutes later, though still below and behind, it will be within 17 miles of the Saturn. At this point, the small thrusters will be fired to accomplish the final phase of the rendezvous. Station keeping, that is, loose formation flying with the Saturn, will then be performed, demonstrating the capability of flying in the vicinity of a second vehicle in outer space. Other tests taking place during the mission will include tests of the life support functions, guidance and propulsion systems, and landmark tracking, in which the astronauts will determine their own position and velocity. By the 5th day of the mission, most of the test objectives will have been completed. During the 11th day after liftoff, within tracking distance of Honolulu, the crew, again in their pressure suits, deorbit will be initiated. The command module will be separated from the service module, oriented for entry, and the descent will begin. By the time they land, the crew of the first manned Apollo, the Apollo 7, will have orbited the Earth 164 times, traveling a distance equal to almost 19 trips to the moon, over 4.5 million miles. And the performance of the spacecraft, the mission support facilities, and the crew itself will have been demonstrated and proven, achieving a critical step toward the goal of a manned lunar landing within this decade.